thinking back to my dental school, and nobody's giving me a nice little placard with literally my face engraved into it. And I'm just thinking, the last place I'd ever want to be is to go back to my alma mater. I had so many bad experiences. But you did something very brave. You came back. And so with 6 lessons, we want to encourage you to continue your education, and hopefully this is a very prosperous, informative session. So as you look at cases that you see either on social media, whether it's Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, maybe you see a before and after. And these before and after pictures don't really share anything. And if you're just right out of dental school, it can be very discouraging because you can see something where you can see the problem, but you don't know how they got to the solution. And so there's this wide chasm, there's this bridge that if you're a newly graduated dental student, you don't understand all the steps it takes to create an outcome that you would say might be on a mastership level. And I'm willing to tell you that the after picture doesn't tell nearly a tenth of the story. How many pictures can you see on this slide? As I've been sitting up here, I've been counting how many people are in here. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, let's use this. Great. Yeah. All right, is this better? There's a lot less feedback, which is, I could have done the whole lecture for 2 hours, but it would have been, I had to really make sure I'm like, ooh. I know. All right. So on this slide, you can count 30 pictures. And each one of these 30 pictures represent a specific technique to ensure that we have a situation where we moved from a traditional dental approach where you would cut something down for a crown after a root canal to something that is very different, something that is non-retentive and actually can preserve more tooth structure. One of my favorite things about India is you have a specialty called endodontics and conservative dentistry. In the United States, endodontics doesn't do anything with restorative dentistry. They literally will do the endo, they kick it back to the general dentist, and what do we... And so you have the great opportunity, if you're in master these techniques so you don't screw it up. So the 3 dental outcomes that dentists face are a biologic, and a biologic failure is when there is a leaking margin that allows for bacteria to create the carious process underneath the restoration. All of us have seen this. The second is a clinical failure, where the patient is telling you, I have a problem, rather than the dentist telling the patient, you have a problem. Now, which of these 2 dental outcomes do you believe the patient feel is more urgent? Probably the second one, because they are experiencing something that is past the normal. Now, biomimetic dentistry can help solve both a biologic failure and a clinical failure, because the last thing we want is a situation where the patient comes in and they say, Doc, I really, really have a problem. My tooth is loose. It is wobbling in the air. Now, when I'm in India, after 6 days, Hillary, I've learned something. And it's something that they showed a little bit in some of the Hollywood movies. But if you ask an Indian a question, they do something that is very different than us Americans. It's a little wobble. Now, this means something to you, and I think it means yes. But if your teeth is doing this, and it's hanging by this core, what's the only answer that the dentist is going to give that patient? We got to pop this out. And so the catastrophic failures that dentists face, and it really is discouraging for a patient or a dentist to see catastrophic failures of dentistry that they did. Oftentimes they start with a biologic failure, they move to a clinical failure, and ultimately a catastrophic failure. Now, biomimetic dentistry, our goal is to prevent all three of these failures and never get to a catastrophic event. Because the catastrophic events that my father was experiencing after 10 years, 15 years of dentistry, all of a sudden he wasn't that excited about being a dentist. Now, I've been a dentist for 7 years. Some of you have been a dentist longer than me, and some of you have been a dentist younger than me. But none of us want to see our own failures. Because when we see our failures, we're actually getting a true representation of who we are that day, or who we were 10 years ago. Now, how many of you have heard yourself recorded on some kind of audio where you hear yourself speak? And what's the first thing you think about? When you've heard yourself on a microphone, on a recording, what do you think? It's too bad. It's weird. Because what you're hearing in your ears is different than what you're hearing in the audience. Now, lucky for me, I've got a bad American accent, so no matter what I say, it's going to sound weird. But as soon as you hear that recording, all of a sudden you have honest feedback of what you really sound like to the world. And it's not a very great feeling. It's the same thing when you start seeing your own dental failures. Now, I think the only reason that I became a dentist after 7 children, I'm number 5. The first 4 decided I don't want to be a dentist. The last 2 decided they didn't really want to be a dentist, was because in my formative years, when I was about 10 years old, I'd see my dad come home from work. And I was excited. And I'd ask my dad, "How was your day at work?" And he would say, "I don't want to talk about it. Let's go hit some golf balls." Now, 2 years later, I've started to become a pretty good golfer because my dad hates dentistry. Because he is seeing these catastrophic or bad failures. It doesn't matter how much money he is earning as a dentist, it's not worth it to him. But then when I'm 13 and he speaks to my 7th grade class, my careers class, all of a sudden he's talking about dentistry in a different light than he did 3 years ago. He's excited. And I didn't understand why he was excited, but all of a sudden this excitement sparked this flame that said, "Davey, you're gonna get old. You're gonna become a grown-up. And you're gonna have to figure out what you're gonna do in life. Because you're a good golfer, but you're not good enough to make any money at it." So I said, "Well, I could be a dentist, and I could also golf." And so that was the day, I remember very specifically, it was in Miss LaFlame's class. That was the day that I decided, "Davey, I'm going to be a dentist." Now, today is September 7th, 2022. This might be the day that you say, I was in a lecture hall that I had a lot of bad memories in, and all of a sudden something changed. Today is the day that I'm going to be a biomimetic dentist. I'm sick and tired of murdering teeth. I'm sick and tired of removing more tooth structure for the sake that the restoration doesn't just pop off. Because as soon as you cut a tooth down for a crown, all of a sudden you can never really gain what you removed. And if it doesn't strengthen the tooth, then we are weakening the tooth and we are increasing the likelihood of a possible catastrophic event. Not only that, when we remove more tooth structure, especially on the bottom third of the tooth, which we call the biorim, the forces of occlusion are transferred there. And as these crowns are being chewed upon, all of a sudden they go from no personality American to the Indian wobble. And this Indian little wobble allows for
bacteria to occur right at the crown margin. And as soon as these little wobbles start to really become very definitive, perhaps you have a patient come in that say, I was chewing a piece of bread and I have my crown in my hand. Can you glue it back on? How many of you heard this? I've heard that. So with biomimetic dentistry, you're going to have a conservative approach. You are going to conserve the bottom half of the tooth. Biomimetic dentistry is a bottom-to-top approach, and it preserves the 2 to 3 millimeters above the CEJ. This prevents the tooth from splitting apart and allows it to be more resistant under tensile forces. Now, the problem is there is a lot of information. How many people live in India? 1 billion. That's 3 times bigger than the United States. Now, imagine every piece of literature being a single person. How many pieces of literature do you think there are on adhesive dentistry? So there's not 1 billion. There may not even be 1 million. But can you imagine doing a puzzle that is more than 2,000 pieces? I can't. 500 to 1,000 is about where I say, okay, that's fun. I never want to see that puzzle again. We finished it. It's the same thing when you are reading literature. How many of you in any of your postdoctoral dissertations or programs have you had to read a boring paper? I've read a boring paper. As soon as I told my dad that I wanted to be a dentist, guess what he started giving me? Boring papers to read. And then after 20, 30 minutes, I would say that I finished reading it. Can we go hit some golf balls? He'd ask me questions. And what would I do? I would fake the answer. I didn't want to disappoint him, but I really wanted to go back to the good old days when we would just go hit golf balls and he would tell me how nice my golf swing was. But there's a huge problem of it, a large amount of information that isn't sorted and it's not put in a hierarchy. And that's our goal with the 6 lessons approach, to make it a learnable, approachable, procedural process that eliminates some of the confusion and the confounding variables. And the 6 lessons is based off of a concept from one of our heroes, Ben Hogan. He was not a doctor, but he was a professional golfer. And he was one of the best golf minds and talents in the history of mankind. Now imagine winning a golf tournament. Okay, that means you were the best that day. Now I want you to imagine winning a golf tournament after you've been hit by a bus. What happens when most people get hit by a bus? Their life is a lot different. Now Ben Hogan actually did get hit by a bus. And after a couple years of rehab, he started winning golf tournaments again. He understood the golf swing so well and the complexities of it that even after a traumatic event to his personal life, he could apply principles that would enable him to win golf tournaments into the future. And he wrote a book called 5 Lessons. So he broke the golf swing into 5 fundamentals. And these 5 fundamentals, if a golfer were to master those, would, in theory, become a better golfer. And so the idea that a challenge will instill a passion that allows for mastery is a principle that we believe each one of you in this room can develop. And the 6 lessons approach to biomimetic dentistry gives you a guideline that allows for predictable treatment of dental caries, a sound understanding of structural compromise, how to seal a tooth on the nanometer level so you can have a adhesive approach rather than a retentive approach, how to stay bonded by minimizing polymerization stress to the hybrid layer, and maximizing your bond strength of your enamel replacement and minimizing occlusal stresses throughout the lifetime of the restoration. So if we look at the hierarchy of importance, lesson 1 would be more important than lesson 2. Lesson 2 is more important than lesson 3, and lesson 3 is more important than 4, 5, and 6. But all of them are important because if you mess up on any one of these stages, you can potentially have a worse dental outcome. So I'm going to read this quote by Dr. Urabi. Novel resin bonding systems have the tensile and cohesive strength of the DEJ region. Accordingly, these materials have sufficient bonding performance. Therefore, new principles for restoration should be established. This was written 22 years ago. Now, I don't know who the youngest person in this room, but perhaps some of the people that are tuning in and to this broadcast are right around 22 years of age. They made a declaration that we need new principles. How many dental schools throughout the world are still teaching GV Black principles? All of them. I have a very close friend who's in dental school. What is she learning right now? Pinned amalgams. Can you imagine learning pinned amalgams when the only reason why you're doing this is so you can get your U.S. license because you were a dentist 10 years before? That's the predicament that this dentist is in.